What's going on, guys? GloveSaveHockey here. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the most recent contract extension with the Montreal Canadiens and Kent Hughes and Jeff Gorton. Jeff Gorton was hired in November of 2021 to kind of oversee hockey operations roles, and then he hired Kent Hughes a couple months later in February and brought him in as the general manager after Marc Bergevin left the organization. I think it was more of like a mutual thing between ownership and him. He had been here for a while already. So what we're going to get into today is 4 years later almost, Kent Hughes has gotten a contract extension from the Montreal Canadiens along with Jeff Gorton that is going to be 5 years in length. So if they do play out at least this whole contract, it's going to be 9 years or so for Gorton and Hughes. So we're going to get into it here. We're going to kind of dissect how their drafts have been, signings, trades, kind of give an overall grade for the Montreal Canadiens management since 2021. All right, so the first thing we're going to go over here is the Kent Hughes, Jeff Gorton draft track record. So the first draft that they were in charge of was the 2022 draft that was in Montreal, and they had the first overall pick. They ended up taking Uri Slafkovsky. Slafkovsky has played in the NHL ever since he was drafted, 206 games, 113 points. As we're looking back on it, it's not the greatest draft overall. You can debate on who could have been the first overall pick. Uri Slafkovsky, Logan Cooley, Shane Wright. You can even throw Lane Hudson in there, even though he's a second-round pick and someone we'll get to in a bit here. But honestly, I think it was a pretty good pick. He's still young. He can still develop. The second pick in the first round was Philip Machar. He's a smaller, skilled right winger who's a pretty good playmaker. As you can tell, last year with Laval, only 4 goals in 42 games. I don't really have a lot of optimism in accordance to him being an everyday NHL player and don't think it's going to end up being a great pick for the Habs when we're looking back on it. Owen Beck is more of a two-way forward. He's played 14 NHL games where he has 1 point. I think he could be a potential third-line center, maybe at worst fourth-line center. I mean, he did put up a little bit of offense last year in the AHL, but I don't think he's got a very high ceiling overall. Now, Lane Hudson, this pick was an absolute snag at 62nd overall. In 90 career games, he's got 66 assists, 6 goals for 72 points. I think you can obviously debate. He's no doubt should have been a top 5 pick. He could have maybe went number 1. We'll see here. A couple other guys I just want to note of from the draft that could be making their way to the Habs roster maybe in the future is Adam Engstrom. He was one of the last cuts this year out of Montreal's training camp. He had 27 points in 66 games as a kind of a left-handed shooting power play running defenseman. He's got 2 assists in 4 games with the Laval Rocket this season. Then the final guy here is Jared Davidson, who was picked 130th overall in the 5th round. I think if anything, he's going to be kind of more of like a strong, small, bottom 6 forward. He did produce a good amount last year with 45 points in 69 games, and he's off to a hot start with 3 points in 4 games so far this season. All right, so we're now on to the 2023 draft for the Habs. We're a little bit better than the season before, but still ended up with the 5th overall pick, and this was a huge debate on who should go where. This was kind of Connor Bedard, the top guys, and Carlson Fantilli, Will Smith, and then number 5, it was like obviously going to be a bit of a drop-off, but Matvei Michkov was still available, and the Habs decided to take David Reinbacher with the 5th overall pick. He's a 6'3", 207-pound, two-way defenseman, where injuries have really derailed his development so far this season. 5 points in 10 games last year. The year before, he played in 46 games if you combine when he played for Cloton in the Swiss League. This season, he got hurt again in the preseason and has not suited up for an AHL game so far this season. I'm hoping at worst he can be like a top 4 right-handed shooting defenseman, but I'm not convinced that it was the right pick looking back on it. Like, even if you didn't want to go the Michkov route, Ryan Leonard's sitting there as well that you could have taken. So, I mean, there's definitely other options. Their second pick of the draft was in the 3rd round this year, where they took goaltender Jacob Fowler. Now, there was some criticism towards Fowler in his draft year. Really good numbers, but a lot of scouts felt that he was out of shape. But as you can tell, like, he's kind of winning everywhere he goes, and his numbers are just phenomenal everywhere he goes. Like, in his draft year, he wins it all, in .921 save percentage, playoff MVP. 2 years in college, .926 and .940 save percentage. He's got a .920 and 2 starts so far this year at Laval. A lot of Habs fans are hoping that he can be the goalie of the future. The next pick we're going to talk about here is in the 4th round, 101st overall. Florian Jacki, Arber's brother. He was also one of the last cuts this season before they made their final roster. I think he could be a potential call-up throughout the season. He is more of a center left winger, gritty guy. Did score 24 goals last year, though, so he's kind of like a unicorn. Can play center, can play the wing, can win face-offs, can score when you need him to as well. So I think we will see Florian Jacki in a Montreal Canadiens uniform, probably next season, to be honest, but maybe a couple times throughout this season. Next pick we're going to be talking about, 9 picks later at 110th overall, is Bogdan Kanushkov. Now, he is a more smaller, 6 foot, 171-pound right-handed defenseman. He's already now 22 years old. He was drafted as an overager, but, I mean, he's consistently been playing in the KHL throughout the last couple of years. Good offensively, good defensively, captain over there as well. He re-signed a 2-year deal with them, so 25 to 27, he will be in Russia, but then he plans coming over to North America and potentially playing with the Canadiens. And the last pick I want to talk about here is Philip Eriksson, 6th rounder, 165th overall. Now, he is a smaller guy at 5'11". I wonder if the Canadiens will give him a chance eventually, considering he's kind of getting better year over year, as you can tell this year. 14 points in 13 games for Luleå in the SHL. Really good playoffs last year at 9 points in 16 games for Djurgårdens in Allsvenskan. But I'm curious to see if maybe Philip Eriksson makes his way over near the end of this season or potentially even next season. All right, so we are now on to the 2024 draft. The Habs, for the second year in a row, had the 5th overall selection. And in this draft, they took Ivan Demidov, who's currently playing with the Montreal Canadiens. He's played 8 NHL games so far with 2 goals, 4 assists for 6 points and 6 penalty minutes. He did play all 5 games in the playoffs last year with the Canadiens as well. He's a very highly skilled, deceptive player that can make things happen in all 3 zones. Realistically, a huge threat on the power play, has a pretty good shot, but he's kind of more known for setting guys up and finding open areas where he can just make plays, and he's got some pretty high skill as well. The Habs had a second first-round pick in this year's draft, which was 21st overall, where they ended up selecting Michael Hage, who was playing for the Chicago Steel at the time, but has now moved on to play for the University of Michigan. Solid season last year, as Michigan wasn't even a great team. He had 34 points in 33 games. In 6 games this year, he's got 5 goals, 6 assists, 11 points. So really hot start from Michael Hage. A lot of people think he might be the answer as a 2C in Montreal in the future, but still probably a couple years away before we might be seeing some sort of impact like that. The next guy I want to talk about here is Owen Protz, 4th rounder, 102nd overall. Now, Owen Protz is kind of more like a strict defensive defenseman, as you can tell. He was under half a point per game in the OHL last year, but he's kind of been labeled as like one of the most violent players on the ice at any given time. He's just rocks guys, his 6'2", 207-pound frame. I'm not really optimistic about him becoming like an everyday NHLer, but maybe he becomes like more of like a 6'7" guy and ends up being a pretty good pick in the 4th round. The next guy we're going to talk about in the 5th round is Tyler Thorpe. He was drafted 130th overall. Last year he played for the Vancouver Giants in the WHL and put up 52 points in 68 games. He's now 20 years old. He's moved on to play with Laval Rocket. He's 6'4", 231 pounds, so I'm curious to see if he could be kind of an option for the 4th line for the Habs in the future. All right, so we are moving on now to this past year's draft in 2025. The Habs had 2 first-round picks at 16th and 17th overall, but they traded it to the New York Islanders along with Emil Heineman to get Noah Dobson. So their first pick of the draft was in the 2nd round, 34th overall, where they selected Alexander Zarovsky, who's currently playing in the KHL. A lot of people are surprised. He did play most of the season in the MHL last year, where he had 50 points in 45 games. Demidov raved a lot about this kid. His skill is just through the roof. He's only listed at 6'1", 163 pounds. I think if this guy does become like a middle 6 option for the Canadiens at some point in the future, it is going to be a little bit down the road once he's able to kind of fill into his body and continue producing at a high level. But he's off to a good start this year with 7 points in 8 games in the KHL. Second guy we're going to talk about is Hayden Papanaukas, who plays in the WHL for the Kelowna Rockets. Unfortunately, after 3 games this year, he did come down with an injury that's going to keep him out for a couple more weeks, but he's a 6'5", 205-pound centerman, where I think he kind of has that power forward style, but he also is a really good skater at the same time. I really look at him down the road, maybe in 6 years or so, and think he could maybe be a 4th line center option for the Montreal Canadiens. The next pick here that we're going to talk about is Bryce Pickford, who was picked 11 picks later. He played on the Medicine Hat Tigers this past year. He's playing for them again this year. They won the WHL championship and went to the Memorial Cup finals, where they lost to the London Knights. Pickford played 48 games where he had 47 points, 20 of those goals as a right-handed defenseman. In the playoffs, in 18 games, 13 goals and 11 assists for 24 points. He's off to a hot start this year with 7 goals in 11 games for 11 points. Maybe he is an option as like a offensive defenseman for the Habs down the road on their right side. He's at 6'1", 186 pounds. I think he definitely needs to improve some of his defensive game if he wants to become an everyday NHL player. And the final player we're going to talk about here from the Hugo draft record is LJ Mooney, who was picked 113th overall in the 4th round. Now, LJ Mooney is a 5'7", 162-pound centerman, but man, can he make things happen. He's playing at University of Minnesota this year, where he's got 4 points in 36 games. His skill and creativity along with his skating is just off the charts. Like, I think this could be like more of like a boom or bust pick for the Canadiens, but I think that taking that risk in the 4th round is definitely worth it. I thought a lot of the guys that were smaller skilled guys could have went a little bit earlier in the draft than they did this past year, and I really like this pick for the Canadiens. All right, so we have gone through all 4 drafts that Kent Hughes and Jeff Gorton have taken a part of as the Montreal Canadiens management. I think they've done a pretty good job with their draft overall, but now we're going to move on to their trade history. I did not involve every single trade in here, mostly the ones that are going to be making the most effect, and more just like ones I didn't include were like AHL for AHL guys and stuff like that. So for the first trade that Kent Hughes made with the Canadiens was on February 14th, 2022, where they traded Tyler Toffoli to the Calgary Flames in exchange for Tyler Pitlick, Emil Heineman, and a 2022 conditional first-round pick along with a 2023 fifth-round pick. Now, Tyler Toffoli was a pretty good player with the Canadiens until he got traded. He was on the Cup run this year prior. To get a player like Emil Heineman, who they ended up using in a trade that we'll get to in the future here, I think was a pretty good pick here with some pretty good asset management. The first round pick ended up being Philip Machar, who we talked about, who I don't think is probably going to be an everyday NHL player, so they didn't really utilize that pick that well. And then the 5th round pick ended up being Yevgeny Volokhin, who is a goaltender who's playing in Russia right now. Goaltenders are kind of a wild card, so you never really know if that's going to turn out. On March 16th, 2022, the Florida Panthers acquired Ben Sherratt from the Montreal Canadiens in exchange for Ty Smilanic, a 2023 first round pick, and a 2024 4th round pick. Now, I thought at the time this was an absolute snag, as the first round pick was for the year after, and I wasn't too sure where Florida was at the time, as they were getting out in the first round a couple times, second round as well. This is the year that they had an unreal regular season, then lost in the second round to Tampa. Montreal did retain $1.75 million of Ben Sherratt's salary. Now, Ben Sherratt was in a position in Montreal where he was playing a lot more than I think he should have been on like a first, second pairing role, and I think he's kind of more of like a number 5 defenseman. Now, this first round pick that Montreal got, they ended up trading it to Colorado for Alex Newhook. We'll get into that. And then Colorado used this pick to select Mikhail Guyalev. The 2022 4th round pick, they ended up selecting Cedric Guindon, who's currently playing in the OHL. So I do think it was good value that Montreal got back. I don't think they really utilized it that well, but I think it was a lot for Bill Zito to give up at the time. On March 21st, 2022, the Canadiens traded Arturi Lehkonen to the Colorado Avalanche in exchange for Justin Barron and a 2024 second-round pick. Now, I love Arturi Lehkonen. At the time, I thought that we got a really good player in return here in Justin Barron in the pick. I was pretty happy about it. Later that year, Colorado goes on to win the Stanley Cup, where Lehkonen scored the game-winning goal to send them to the Stanley Cup Finals, along with the game-winning goal in the Stanley Cup Finals. In the year prior, he scored the game-winning goal to send the Canadiens to the Stanley Cup Finals. So there's a lot of clutch that has been going into Arturi Lehkonen's game as of late. The pick that Montreal acquired ended up being a stud goaltender in the OHL that's currently playing, Carter George. They ended up sending that pick out to LA. It was involved in a move for them to move up in the draft, so that really wasn't ideal. Looking back on it, I think Montreal definitely lost this trade. I think that Kent Hughes wanted to get rid of Lehkonen because they didn't really agree on a contract extension at the time, and he wanted to utilize it. At the time, a lot of people thought that Barron was going to turn out better than he did, but I would definitely say Montreal took the L on this trade. On March 21st, 2022, the Montreal Canadiens traded Brett Kulak to the Edmonton Oilers in exchange for Will Legeson, a 2022 second, and a 2024 seventh. So Brett Kulak was also another good player for the Canadiens during their cup run, but I thought it was definitely time for them to get rid of him, considering the abundance of like left-handed defensemen that Montreal currently has and even did have at the time. I thought it was a good move. So getting a depth player in Will Legeson, he kind of just finished the season out with the Canadiens as they were sort of in tank mode. But this is the thing to keep a note of. That 2022 second-round pick ended up being Lane Hudson. That was selected in the second round, 62nd overall. And then the other pick, the 2024 seventh, the Canadiens a couple years ago selected defenseman Rasmus Bergqvist out of Sweden. Looking back on this trade, I don't think there's any doubt the Canadiens won it. If you're looking at Brett Kulak, I understand he's still a member of the Edmonton Oilers, but to get such a high-impact player in Lane Hudson is definitely a win for Montreal. On June 16th, 2022, the Montreal Canadiens traded Shea Weber's contract to the Vegas Golden Knights in exchange for Evgeny Dodonov. I mean, this at the time put Montreal in a better position to surround some of their offense more with a guy that had produced in the past but was coming off kind of a little bit of a rough year. He didn't really end up playing that well with the Canadiens, but I thought this was a pretty good move to kind of lower their LTIR use, considering Shea Weber was never going to play eventually, and that Evgeny Dodonov got a chance to kind of reinvent himself with the Canadiens. All right, so the next trade on July 7th, 2022, the Montreal Canadiens acquired a first-round pick from the New York Islanders in exchange for defenseman Alexander Romanov and a fourth-round pick in 2022. That fourth-round pick ended up being Isaiah George, who played about 30-plus games for the Islanders last season. He's definitely one of their better defensive prospects, I would say. And that first-round pick that Montreal got, they ended up trading it away. We're going to go through that trade right now because it is kind of connected, where they went out and got Kirby Dach in exchange for a first-round pick and a third-round pick. That third-round pick ended up being Gavin Hayes, who hasn't made any impact in the NHL. But that first-round pick was Frank Nazar, who is having a heck of a time right now with the Blackhawks, and he's producing really well. So looking at this trade overall, I don't really love this part of it, where Montreal got Kirby Dach, who's been dealing with injuries, hasn't really shown his full potential, and Frank Nazar has kind of passed him in accordance to NHL impact right now. But I thought it was a pretty good trade, like getting a first-round pick for Alexander Romanov, considering the abundance of left-handed shooting defensemen in the Canadian system. He didn't really fit at the time, and he's not really going to fit in their system if they had him right now. So I like this trade for the Canadiens, but I wasn't too optimistic about this trade with Frank Nazar, as he was definitely one of the more skilled players from that draft. On July 16, 2022, the Montreal Canadiens traded Jeff Petrie and Ryan Poehling to the Pittsburgh Penguins in exchange for Mike Matheson and a 2023 fourth-round pick. That 2023 fourth-round pick ended up being Bogdan Konushkov, that defenseman we were talking about from Russia, who's expected to come over to the NHL in the next couple seasons. Okay, so this trade overall, I love this trade for the Canadiens. Mike Matheson, over the last couple years, not so much last year, but he had been a huge force on their power play, eating up minutes, just such a huge part of their system. Now, Jeff Petrie didn't really last long in Pittsburgh, and neither did Ryan Poehling. At this time, they were definitely trying to make a move to bolster their roster so they could be better with Sid. I think that a lot of people were seeing Mike Matheson in Pittsburgh, and it was kind of like almost getting in the way of Letang, as like Mike Matheson wouldn't have been the number one power play guy. But I thought Montreal taking this risk and to add like a veteran defenseman was definitely a good move for them at the time, and it's paid off. On August 18th, 2022, Ken Hughes probably made debatably one of the best trades that he's made as a Montreal Canadiens GM, as he acquired Sean Monahan in a 2025 conditional first-round pick from the Calgary Flames in exchange for future considerations. So there's kind of a lot to unpack on this trade. There was a lot of conditions, and a lot of this ties into some trades that we're going to talk about in the future. He was heading into the last year of his deal at the time at $6.375 million, but he was injured a ton the year before. Calgary basically made this move so they could free up the cap space to sign Nazem Kadri at $7 million, but I think this move definitely paid off for the Canadiens, as they got two pretty solid seasons from Sean Monahan and a good return for him in the future. On February 22nd, 2023, the Montreal Canadiens traded Evgeny Dodonov to the Dallas Stars in exchange for Denis Gurianov. Evgeny Dodonov at the time, it just really wasn't working out with the Habs. 18 points in 50 games. Gurianov only had 9 in 43 games as like a high pick. I thought this was kind of worth the Habs bringing in a guy who was a high pick, maybe needed a change of scenery to see if it would work out. It obviously didn't really work out, and Dadonov did re-sign with the Stars for 2 years. I'd say Dallas probably ended up winning this trade overall, as they got a couple good years from Dadonov. On June 27, 2023, the Canadiens traded their first-round pick, which was 31st overall, a second-round pick in 2023, which was 37th overall, and defenseman Gianni Fairbrother, to the Colorado Avalanche in exchange for Alex Newhook. Now, Alex Newhook is an Eastern Canadian guy. I believe he grew up cheering for the Montreal Canadiens, so I feel like this was a good move at the time, considering a couple of years before, like, they go out and get Kirby Dach. They like to go out and get players that kind of fit their timeline. Gianni Fairbrother kind of just running out of time in the Montreal system as like a left-handed shooting defenseman. And as you can tell, this was the pick that they got from Florida, and Colorado ended up drafting Mikhail Gulyayev, the defenseman we were talking about earlier. And then the second-round pick, this ended up getting moved on to Tampa Bay as Colorado traded for Ross Colton, and they drafted Ethan Gauthier with that pick. I really like this move for the Canadiens. I don't really think we would have got a player at 31 or 37 that would have more NHL impact than Alex Newhook at the moment. And I think he's been a pretty good depth option, and he's been playing pretty good on the power play. So definitely a good trade for Ken Hughes. On July 1st, 2023, the Montreal Canadiens traded Joel Edmondson to the Washington Capitals in exchange for a 3rd and 7th round pick, both in 2024. Joel Edmondson at the time was dealing with a lot of injuries. The Habs ended up retaining half of his salary just to make it work within Washington's cap. I think it was really worth getting out of this deal, to be honest, even though they drafted a couple guys that I'm not super optimistic about in Logan Sawyer and Makar Cannon. It just paved the way for more young guys to get an opportunity here and more for Ken Hughes to make a stamp on this team. On August 6, 2023, the Canadiens made a trade with the Pittsburgh Penguins where the Penguins acquired Mike Hoffman and Rem Pitlick, and the Canadiens acquired Jeff Petrie, Casey DeSmith, prospect Nathan Legare, and a 2025 second-round pick. So the Canadiens reacquired Jeff Petrie after he asked to be out of Montreal 2 seasons prior. The Canadiens ended up flipping him. We'll talk about that trade in a minute. But to get out of Mike Hoffman's contract at $4.5 million, where he just kind of had an abysmal season the year before, I thought was a huge plus. And Rem Pitlick was more of a depth guy they were trying to give a chance to, but he wasn't getting a chance, and he wanted to go somewhere else where he could prove himself. Nathan Legare really hasn't turned out to be anything, just more of like an AHL player at this time. Casey DeSmith had some good years in Pittsburgh, had some pretty bad years in Pittsburgh. So I think this trade ends up being worth it considering what we're going to talk about the next couple trades. So 9 days after reacquiring Jeff Petrie, on August 15th, the Montreal Canadiens traded Jeff Petrie to the Detroit Red Wings in exchange for defensive prospect Gustav Lindstrom and a conditional 2025 4th-round pick. The Canadiens also retained half of his salary. I thought this was definitely a solid move to get out of Jeff Petrie's contract, considering that 6.25 is a lot of money for what he can provide at this time. Montreal ended up moving that pick to Tampa Bay, where they selected Benjamin Rutinainen. Gustav Lindstrom played some games with the Habs, but was more of just kind of like a fill-in piece as they were kind of starting their rebuild. But I like this trade from Montreal to acquire another pick in that trade that just keeps going on from the Pittsburgh-Montreal one. Montreal Canadiens traded Casey DeSmith to the Vancouver Canucks in exchange for Tanner Pearson and a 3rd-round pick in 2025. Tanner Pearson ended up playing the season with the Canadiens where he wasn't really the best. Casey DeSmith wasn't really that great with the Canucks either the year he was there. He ended up losing his job in the playoffs, and Artur Silov's got a lot of starts. That 3rd-round pick ended up being Cooper Simpson, who ended up being picked by the Boston Bruins. Montreal ended up moving on from that pick. So, again, you're getting another 3rd-round pick, two 3rd-round picks, actually, if you're looking at the Casey DeSmith and Jeff Petrie trade to add on for getting rid of Mike Hoffman. So I think that's pretty good asset management. On February 2nd, 2024, the Montreal Canadiens traded Sean Monahan to the Winnipeg Jets in exchange for a 2024 first and a conditional 2027 3rd-round pick. So this is what I'm saying about the Sean Monahan trade from before. They got a 1st-round pick to take him on, and they got a 1st-round pick for Winnipeg to take him as a rental for the rest of the season. They didn't retain any of his salary as Montreal re-signed him after that first season for $1.985. Montreal ended up moving on from that 1st-round pick where LA ended up selecting Liam Greentree because Montreal moved up in the draft to draft Michael Hage. And that 3rd-round pick, the conditions didn't end up being met, so Montreal ended up just getting a 1st-round pick for Sean Monahan. But pretty good asset management from Ken Hughes to get 2 1st-round picks for Monahan. On March 8th, 2024, the Montreal Canadiens traded Jake Allen to the New Jersey Devils in exchange for a 2025 3rd-round pick. It was a conditional pick where if Allen played 40 games last year, it would have been a 2nd-round pick. Jake Allen's been a pretty solid backup goalie for the New Jersey Devils. He definitely struggled in his last season with the Canadiens with an .892 save percentage. The Canadiens were running with a 3-goalie system with Montembeault, Primo, and Jake Allen, and it felt like Allen was the odd man out, with Primo having a pretty solid rookie season overall. I will say, though, that I think this trade has turned out really well for the New Jersey Devils and would probably give them the edge in this deal, but I don't blame Hughes for making this deal whatsoever. On June 30th, 2024, the Canadiens made another trade with the New Jersey Devils where they sent Jonathan Kovacevic out for a 2026 4th-round pick. At the time, it felt like it was the right move to move on from Kovacevic because Montreal had a lot of defensemen and someone had to go. But looking back on it, I think Jonathan Kovacevic would probably fit really nice with the Canadiens right now. And he played really well last year with the Devils, got a really nice contract, a 5-year deal, paying him $4 million a year. I like this move for the Devils overall. I think Montreal ended up getting fleeced a little bit with this trade as Jonathan Kovacevic has turned out to be a good player. On August 19th, 2024, the Montreal Canadiens acquired Patrick Laine from the Columbus Blue Jackets, along with a 2026 second-round pick in exchange for defenseman Jordan Harris, another defenseman where Montreal had to move on from because they just had too many of these guys. Jordan Harris now playing with the Bruins as more of like a seventh defenseman. Patrick Laine, he kind of wanted out of Columbus. I felt at the time like I don't love the player he is, especially 5-on-5, but at the time, Montreal kind of struggled to score goals. Like, their only guy really scoring goals is Cole Caulfield. So to bring in a guy that can score an easy goal, I think was a really solid move. And he did play well last season. They still have the second-round pick in 2026 from the Blue Jackets they haven't even used yet. So he's going to the last year of his deal. I don't think he's going to re-sign, but this is definitely an A move. On December 18th, 2024, the Canadiens acquired Alexander Carrier from the Nashville Predators in exchange for Justin Barron. Now, this trade, I think, kind of helped turn the Canadian season around. They were just lacking playing defense, and Alexander Carrier is more of like a veteran guy who's like a stabilizer, good skater, not overly physical at like 5'11", but definitely a guy that can come and help the young guys, and he has really helped the young guys overall for the 10 months he's been here. Justin Barron was in and out in the lineup, kind of unproven at this point, not too sure what his upside is. Alexander Carrier, definitely the better player at the moment, and he's under cap control for the next 2 years at 3.75, so great move for Hughes and Gorton. On June 27, 2025, Hughes and Gorton made the biggest trade that I think they have in their tenure here. They acquired Noah Dobson from the New York Islanders in exchange for Emil Heineman, 2 first-round picks in the 2025 draft, which ended up being 16th and 17th overall. Now, Noah Dobson has come in and I think been a solid staple of the Canadiens' defense so far this year. A lot of people just don't realize just how much he's a calming presence, especially even on the defensive side of the puck, and he has shown flashes of putting up high-end offense at the same time. I was a little bit shocked at the 9.5 number at first. I do think he'll probably end up being worth it in the future. I'd be more confident with him probably at like $8 million though. But with the cap going up significantly, I think I will probably like this contract a little bit more as it progresses. Emil Heineman was a really good depth player for the Canadiens last year with 10 goals in 62 games. Was one of the best defensive forwards for the Canadiens last year as well, and I think that he could be a big part of like the Islanders' bottom six as in the coming years, as they do have some other solid prospects, but you need good depth guys as well, right? And they kind of want to reinvent their bottom six. One of the first round picks that they had was the Calgary pick that they got for Sean Monahan. So they pretty much just took Sean Monahan with that first and used that first to put in a deal to get Noah Dobson, which is just nuts to me. Victor Eklund was used with that pick to be selected. Then the second first round pick with Kayshawn Aitchison. I love the Victor Eklund pick for the Islanders. I think he can be a top 6 forward for them in the future. But overall, to get a first pairing defenseman in Noah Dobson, I think is a solid move for Ken Hughes. On July 1st, 2025, the Montreal Canadiens made a 1-for-1 trade with the St. Louis Blues. They acquired Zach Bolduc and they shipped out Logan Mailloux. Now, this is a couple days after acquiring Noah Dobson, and Logan Mailloux was considered to be one of the Canadiens' best prospects and like one of their better defensive prospects, considering it's just basically him, Kanushkov, Reinbacher. But after bringing in Noah Dobson, I kind of felt that Logan Mailloux didn't really have a path to becoming like a top 4 defenseman with the Montreal Canadiens. If you look at St. Louis' system, after bringing in like Broberg, like they don't have a lot of young defensemen, so it does make sense for them to go out and target a player like this. But I never really understood why they would give up on Zach Bolduc, considering he played like 3rd, 4th line minutes at times last year, second power play, scored 19 goals and 36 points. And he's off to a hot start this year with the Canadiens with 3 goals. So I really like this move for the Canadiens as they get a guy who's French. He has produced in like a middle 6 capacity, and he's getting an opportunity to play in the top 6 and on the first power play. I think that we're going to look back on this, and Montreal is going to win this move, considering there is still some question marks about Logan Mailloux, whether he can play defense at the NHL level and whether the offense will come at the NHL level. So really like this move for Hughes and Gorton. So the final trade that they have made to date was shipping out longtime loved goaltender Carey Price. It's just shipping out his $10.5 million contract for the last year and a 2026 5th-round pick in exchange for prospect Gannon LaRocque. So if people don't really understand why the Canadiens did this, considering you can just throw his contract on LTIR. When you throw a contract on LTIR, you don't accumulate cap space throughout this season. So now the Canadiens have gotten out of Shea Weber's contract a couple years ago and Carey Price's contract for this year. The Canadiens are not in LTIR and actually have a little bit of cap space now. So they're able to accumulate cap space throughout the season and can potentially go make a move at some point. So this was a really good move to get out of this contract and only have to give up a 5th round pick in exchange. So we've wrapped up all the trades that I want to go through here. The last thing we're going to talk about is signings. So the same thing as trades. If it's more of like a minor league, doesn't really have impact on the NHL. I'm not going to mention it here. So the first signing we're going to talk about, July 18th, 2022, Sam Montembeault was given a 2-year extension at $1 million. This came off of his first season when he was claimed off waivers by Mark Bergevin, actually, before Kent Hughes got there. This was a pretty good extension considering that Montembeault didn't have a good season when he came over here and Carey Price was no longer going to play. He was a local guy and it was definitely worth taking the risk. On September 7th, 2022, a couple of months after acquiring him, Kirby Dach signed a 4-year, $13.45 million contract with the Canadiens, which has a cap hit of 3.362. At the time, I thought if Kirby Dach could stay healthy that this was an absolute no-brainer of a deal. He hasn't really stayed healthy, hasn't really produced a lot. I would say this contract is probably around market value for Kirby Dach. On October 1st, 2022, Jake Allen signed a 2-year, $7.7 million deal with the Canadiens that had a cap hit of 3.85. He played a year and a half of this contract with the Montreal Canadiens before getting shipped out to the New Jersey Devils. I don't think that he was really worth this deal considering he came off not so great of a season, then didn't have great of a season afterwards. I know he's kind of rebounded a bit in New Jersey, but I don't think they got great value for this on this contract. On February 10th, 2023, the Canadiens signed Jordan Harris to a 2-year, $2.8 million deal, which had a cap hit of $1.4 million. He was shipped out after 1 year of this contract to the Columbus Blue Jackets. I honestly thought this was a pretty good depth signing at the time. It's not really a huge risk at $1.4 million considering he wasn't in the lineup every night, but at 22 years old coming off his ELC, not too bad of a contract. On June 5th, 2023, the Canadiens signed Cole Caulfield to an 8-year, $62.8 million contract, which is a cap hit of $7.85 million. This was definitely a really good signing for Kent Hughes and the Montreal Canadiens, considering Nick Suzuki signed the year prior for about $25,000 more on an 8-year deal. So you have some of the core locked up here for under $8 million, and it really kind of sets a standard for future contracts. On June 20th, 2023, the Canadiens signed Sean Monahan to a 1-year, $1.99 million contract. He ended up getting shipped out at the deadline on this deal to Winnipeg where they got a first-round pick, but he came off of that $6.3 million contract. He was injured a lot of the season, but in this season in particular, he played really well, which allowed the Canadiens to maximize his value and get a first-round pick for him. Solid contract for the Canadiens. On July 11th, 2023, the Canadiens signed Alex Newhook to a 4-year, $11.6 million deal, which has a cap hit of $2.9 million. He is right in the middle of it right now. I think that Alex Newhook was kind of a little bit snake-bitten last year. 15 goals, but didn't really put up too many points overall. I think that this has been a pretty solid contract for the Canadiens. I wouldn't say it's like a steal because he's not really producing at a high level, but for a depth player who's young, I think this is a pretty good contract for the Canadiens. On December 1st, 2023, the Canadiens signed Sam Montembeault to a 3-year, $9.45 million extension, has a cap hit of 3.15, which he's currently in the second of 3 years of this deal. Really solid contract for Montembeault and the Canadiens as he came off that 2-year, $2 million deal. Definitely proved himself, getting better every single season, and has turned into the Canadiens' starting goalie. Really solid contract, as there are a lot of other goalies that are getting more money and longer deals than this. On July 1st, 2024, the Canadiens locked up their previous first-round selection in Juraj Slafkovsky to an 8-year, $60.8 million deal, which has a cap hit of $7.6 million. This contract is just coming into effect this season. I wasn't too optimistic at the time about this contract, considering I didn't really know about the cap going up. It definitely looks better that the cap has gone up, but Slafkovsky hasn't really got off to the greatest starts the last couple seasons and has turned it around at the midway point. I really want to see him be consistent throughout the season and have a year where he's putting up 60 to 70 points. On July 30th, 2024, the Canadiens signed Arbor Xhekaj to a 2-year, $2.6 million deal. He's currently in the last year of this deal where he's getting paid $1.3 million a year. For a guy who's like a 6'7" defenseman, I think this is a pretty solid contract, and Arbor Xhekaj definitely provides some value that the Canadiens don't have. On July 30th, 2024, the Canadiens also signed Justin Barron to a 2-year, $2.3 million deal with a cap hit of 1.15. I think they just looked at it and Gorton thought he has a little bit less value than Arbor Xhekaj, and this was kind of a good number that they could agree on. So another good bridge deal for the Montreal. On July 31st, 2024, the Canadiens signed Kaiden Guhle to a 6-year, $33.3 million deal, which has a cap hit of $5.55 million. This contract just came into effect this season. I think with the cap going up and Kaiden Guhle already being a top 4 defenseman, that this is going to look like a hell of a contract in a couple years and definitely going to be an underpay. On March 4th, 2025, the Canadiens signed Jake Evans to a 4-year, $11.4 million extension, which has a cap hit of $2.85. I think Evans definitely could have got more than this on the open market, considering how thin the center ice position was this past offseason, but he elected to take a little bit less to stay in Montreal. One of the best penalty killers in the NHL, and definitely had a career season last year where he was producing at higher than he had in his previous years, but I really like this deal as a depth centerman, and that Montreal lacks centerman overall, so it was really good to re-sign him. On July 6, 2025, the Canadiens signed Jakub Dobeš to a 2-year, $1.93 million extension, which is a cap hit of $965,000. He's currently in the first year of this, where he is backing up Sam Montembeault, but I wouldn't be surprised if he takes some starts from him. Montembeault hasn't looked great to start the year. Dobeš is off to a 2-0 start, and he's getting the start against the Buffalo Sabres tonight. So we'll see what he can end up doing. Maybe he will end up taking over the job. Maybe he just will be a backup that plays 25 to 30 games. But he's had a pretty impressive career so far, and I think this is definitely a no-brainer to sign him as a backup goalie. On July 16th, 2025, the Canadiens signed Joe Veleno to a 1-year, $900,000 contract. Joe Veleno used to be represented by Ken Hughes back when he was an agent, so there is some mutual connection here. I think with the Canadiens' lack of center depth and Veleno being a Quebec guy, this is definitely a place that he wanted to be. He's only played in 1 game so far. We'll see if he can get into more games, but I'm not considered he's an everyday NHLer on the Montreal Canadiens. On July 28th, 2025, the Canadiens signed Jayden Struble to a 2-year, $2.83 million extension, which is a cap hit of $1.412. Jayden Struble, I feel like, as a guy who's not talked about a ton as being a pretty solid stay-at-home defenseman who can provide some physicality at the same time. I think it's just because it's almost him or Xhekaj in the lineup, and Xhekaj is obviously the center of attention when it comes to that stuff that a lot of people don't know about Struble. I think he could be an everyday NHL defenseman, but he's just not really getting the opportunity. But maybe if he plays a little bit better, he'll end up taking that spot as the number 6 defenseman. And the final contract is probably one of the biggest ones. The Canadiens on October 13th signed Lane Hutson to an 8-year, $70.8 million extension, which is going to have a cap hit of $8.85 million, not even starting until the 26-27 season. I think this is a gamble for Lane Hutson, to be honest. Even if he doesn't end up being a complete defenseman and only is able to drive offense, there's going to be a lot of high-quality defensemen that are going to get paid in the next couple years and could be making even somewhat close to double what Lane Hutson just signed for. So I think this is going to be no-brainer, one of the best defensive contracts in the NHL, and I'm excited to see how he progresses throughout his career. So that's going to do it for overviewing the Ken Hughes, Jeff Gorton era, as they were hired in 2021, early 2022 for Ken Hughes, and I think they've done a really good job so far with this rebuild. There's only a couple of moves and signings and trades where I'm just kind of like, I don't really understand it too much, and I think most of their moves have been either really good or just solid for the most part. So I'm going to give them an A overall of how they've done with this core. They've definitely kind of excelled the rebuild, even though if that wasn't their intention. And after making the Cup Finals in 2021, they're back into the playoffs in 2025 already passing a couple teams in their rebuild. So definitely a good job from them. Thank you very much for watching. Hope to see you guys in the next video. Please like and subscribe.